Now, let's turn it over to an expert to talk about some historical prohibited practices that helped to bring about the Fair Housing Act of 1968.
July 18th, 2012, I woke up in Boston, hopped into my car, and made my way down to Baltimore. And when I got off of the highway, I was greeted by rows upon rows of abandoned row homes. I had never seen anything like that in my entire life, and it wasn't until reading Antero Piattola's Not in My Neighborhood and Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations that I would learn of the term, practice, and concept of redlining. During the 1930s and the Franklin Roosevelt administration was the creation of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and they created a series of maps of every metropolitan area in this entire country, shading in red all the areas where Black, African American, or the equivalent derogatory term resided. Once the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, came into being, they would create restrictions around Black home ownership, whether it would be through restricting funds for housing developments or failing to insure mortgages for homes. It made it very challenging for Black people to own homes during that time. In addition to the restrictions from the government, there were also local and regional restrictions as well. And so what I have with me here is the Northwood area of Baltimore. This is the original deed and agreement around who could reside in this neighborhood. And so when I flip over to page 5, on page 5, under the headline, No Nuisances, under that section on page 6, and I'll share that now, it says, At no time shall the land included in said tract or any part thereof, or any building erected thereon, be occupied by any Negro or person of Negro extraction. This prohibition, however, is not intended to include the occupancy by a Negro domestic servant. So this very house that we're filming in, this very house where I'm talking about these restrictions that originated with the government, I actually wouldn't have been allowed to live in this house, to own this house, definitely not, but I could be in this house if I were a domestic servant. And this would go on between the creation of the redlining maps, between the FHA restrictions, between these housing covenants. This would go on until 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was enacted. My name is Natalie Gillard. I'm the creator of Factuality, and it is a crash course on structural inequality that ties the implications of redlining to our present circumstances and challenges in our various communities. So this all began when I was reimagining what the game of Monopoly would look like, could operate like if I were a character. As a Black woman, what do I have access to? Could I purchase property? And if so, on what quarter of the board? Or am I most inclined to find myself as a renter? So thinking through the implications of redlining, understanding that the majority of the areas that were originally redlined are predominantly people of color and low income, as well as the majority of the areas that are being gentrified are predominantly areas that were originally redlined. So when you bring that over into this game board, well, what does that look like for these individuals? So this is a fact-based game, and the character development comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who reports out on 4 particular racial groups in this country. And each character receives income based on race and gender, so it's staggered. And so when you're looking at Layla, that African-American woman, that's me thinking through, how could I access this space as a Black person, as a Black woman? And so if we're taking a look at redlining, we're taking a look at these originally redlined spaces, especially on this Baltimore board. So there's a Baltimore equivalent to the American version, but on this Baltimore board, if we're looking at the first 2 quarters of the board that are outlined in red, these are the 12 areas that were originally redlined in this city. I superimposed the current neighborhood composition against the Homeowners Loan Corporation map from the 1930s and extracted 12 areas that were originally redlined that remain disenfranchised. And those areas are Harlem Park, Upton, Sandtown, Old Town, Oliver, Cherry Hill, Downtown, Waverly, Holland's Market, Pigtown, Reservoir Hill, and Highland Town. So these areas still remain disenfranchised 80 years later. So it's definitely drawing ties to restrictions that were federally sanctioned and the present day outcomes. And so for individuals who largely live in these red line spaces, they have challenges to this day around education inequity, access to healthy food. There's an increased likelihood of having asthma and lead poisoning. If we think of Freddie Gray, lead poisoning tied to the originally red line space, it's all interconnected. Redlining impacts your access to employment opportunities. It also impacts the quality of the air you breathe because the positioning of neighborhoods, and it also impacts the temperature of your neighborhoods. And so if we're taking a look at back to Sandtown, for instance, in comparison to Roland Park, which was always a more affluent space, we're looking at the quality of the neighborhood, we're looking at the quality of the schools, what those services look like, and it's like night and day differences. But what many of us don't realize is the role that the government has had in all of this. I have been developing diversity initiatives for over a decade now, and the most effective way that I could create dialogue around structural inequities is through this game experience that takes a deep dive into redlining. And in many instances, I'm encountering people over the course of a decade-long career who question, why does this matter? Or this was so long ago, why do we still talk about it? Well, it's really important to understand the implications of the origins of our challenges. And so as a quick example, in order to get out of high school, you had to graduate from 8th grade. But to get out of 8th grade, you had to graduate from kindergarten. The same thing with the origins of these issues. We have to acknowledge the challenges around the creation of redlining and the implications present day if we're ever going to figure out and identify a solution to reconcile this. The Fair Housing Act allegedly ended this in 1968, but it's still going on in a variety of different forms, whether it's subprime loans or realtor failing to show certain groups, certain properties, or making the process very cumbersome depending on what you look like on the outside because we're not colorblind. So we need to dive into this issue. We need to figure out a way to make housing opportunities equitable because that's the way that we're going to make change in our communities. Again, my name is Natalie Gillard. I'm the creator of Factuality. You can find me at Factuality, FACTUALITY, the game, factualitythegame.com. I look forward to hearing